So now let's go ahead and talk about drum fills. In synthwave music, the kicks and snares do most of the heavy lifting for the overall driving rhythm of the track, but they rarely ever switch their rhythm. The fills and rhythmic accents are done by synthesized high, low, and mid tom drums. These synth toms are characteristic of a lot of different 80s music, and can be heard on numerous different tracks from that era. It is worth noting that these synthesized toms are distinctly different from acoustic drum sounds. Basically, the synth toms are created by a sine wave pitch sweep. So to get the proper sound, you'll want to be using a vintage drum machine sample or an actual vintage drum machine if you have one available. The two that are used quite frequently are the Oberheim DMX, so the tom drums from that one. This is a vintage drum machine. And then the Simmons drum machines like the SDS 800 or the SDS 8 sound quite good for this type of thing as well. In this track, we're going to go ahead and be using some synth toms that are a bit clearer sounding. So we want to use the synth toms from the Oberheim DMX drum machine. But feel free to use any of the synth toms that you like. Some are more simple and clean, and some are more intense and distorted in this kind of cool 80s synthetic way. So it just depends on what works better for your track. Just be sure that they're nice and synthetic sounding, and they don't sound too much like an acoustic tom drum sound. So we'll be using the stuff from the UVI workstation again, but you can always go online and just Google the name of the drum machine that we're using, which in this case is going to be the Oberheim DMX. You can always Google that and try to find some samples. There's probably some stuff laying around. So we can copy that over. I'll rename this to Toms. Then we can also delete the MIDI clips here. And then we can open that up and go over to our tom drum sounds, which are going to be these ones here at the bottom. And the first thing I want to do is make sure that all of these are set to have no pan, so that they're all at 0. By default, they may be adjusted differently, so make sure that they're not panned individually. Then we also want to make sure that all of our effects devices are turned off as well. So if you're loading in a new copy of this, make sure that they're turned off. And then let's go ahead and load up the tom drums from the Oberheim DMX drum machine. And then we want to go ahead and go over to the Drum MX. And we're going to go down to tom drum number 5, which on its own just sounds like this. I'll go ahead and change the tuning back to what it was by default, because we changed it for our snare drum in one of the previous videos. That just sounds like this. So it's that very 80s synth tom. Make sure to turn the attack all the way down so we get the nice punch at the beginning of it. Then we're going to take this first one and we're going to turn this down by -2 semitones. So we get that kind of nice low end sound. Then we're going to go ahead and copy that over to our other drum machines here. We'll go back to the Drum MX, go over to sample number 5, turn off that distortion, and then we're going to leave this at its default pitch. So we can almost play kind of this pitched tom roll. Now let's load that up onto slot number 5 as well. So we'll go back to the toms, go to Drum MX, and tom drum number 5. And then we're going to pitch this up by 4 semitones and turn off that distortion. And that sounds like this. So this enables us to create interesting pitched tom drum sounds. From there, let's go ahead and just add in a few different effects devices to clean everything up. The first of which will just be an EQ8 to cut out those low frequencies that we don't need. So basically just the sub bass. We'll go ahead and change this over to 140. So don't really change the character of everything, we just kind of cut out that low end sub bass. Because we don't really need it for this specific sound. And then from there, let's also add in Ableton Live's built-in saturator. They give us some analog modeled distortion. There's a bunch of ways of recreating this. There's some really good third-party tape plugins. For example, the Isotope tape plugin that comes as part of their mastering suite is really, really excellent for this type of thing. You can throw it on a drum bus and it gives you a very nice vintage tape sound. But for the sake of this video, I want to use some plugins that everybody had access to show you that you can get this kind of sound without going and investing tons of money in plugins. So we'll just be adding a touch of some nice analog model distortion. So make sure it's on the analog clipping mode. Put that drive up to an amount of 16. And then it's going to boost the volume quite considerably. So let's go ahead and change that down to -12. And that sounds like this. Kind of just fattens everything up rather nicely. And then from there, let's go ahead and add in some drum fills. So we'll create a 1-bar clip here, then do Command-Shift-M to create a new MIDI clip. Change this over to 16th note. Then we want to add in some different notes here. The first of which is going to be a higher up note, which is going to be C in the 2nd octave. We can just drag that down to here, which will be C in the 2nd octave. We could put that about here, so it kind of starts about halfway through this sort of 2nd section. As you can see, it starts at that 4th bar. And we want to create this offbeat rhythmic pattern, which will provide a nice shuffle for everything inside of our drums. So we'll have our first note hit there, then we'll go over 1 note, and we'll go down to this A, which is kind of that mid-tom drum sound. We'll have that hit twice, and then we'll go ahead and have the low tom hit right here, which sounds like this. So on its own, you can really hear that kind of nice analog style distortion on it too, giving it that nice crunch and kind of tape sound. And by itself, it sounds very dry, but we'll actually be adding in a gated reverb to this patch a bit later, so don't worry about how dry everything sounds. You can just listen to what this sounds like in context of our drum loop. So I'll just copy that over another time. And it sounds like this. So you can hear it gives us that nice shuffle, especially the end of the pattern, kind of switches things up. And because we use these offbeat patterns, as opposed to taking everything and taking it on beat, it gives us this sort of interesting shuffled feel. So this feels a little bit more like a straight rhythm. Doesn't feel quite as interesting and shuffled, whereas this kind of accentuates those offbeats and makes it feel nice and fresh. Then from there, the other change that I want to make is just change the level control. Just bring that down a little bit. Because right now it's pretty loud, so we can just bring that down to just under 12. Maybe just boost that a little bit. Now we'll be doing a more detailed mix later. That's just to kind of get things generally balanced. So once we start adding things, we don't have any clipping, and everything's just generally at the level where it needs to be. But just by adding in this simple offbeat rhythmic feel at the end of our drum pattern, really freshens everything up for the listener, and it'll make it more interesting. So that's all for the tom drum video. In the next video, we'll be adding in some hi-hats.